All right. Now I just got to remember to save it afterwards.
Yes. I don't know how you do that, so best of luck.
Thank you.
All right. Um, start with this one.
Oops. Okay, good.
Okay, so I put this presentation together for a training I did recently at DCYF. So I did try and make some changes to make it more applicable to us specifically and to volunteers opposed to DCYF, but really starts at the basics and goes into the power and control wheel, which hopefully we're all familiar with to a degree at this point. But I think it's a good review for everyone to have at one time or another. So again, domestic violence at the core, power and control. The purpose is to gain power or control over another individual. So one section of the power and control wheel, and I will send the PDF to you guys as well, but I kind of broke down each section, and these are kind of some examples of minimizing that we see a lot of victims do in various situations. So, and recognizing those signs, some of those signs may be perpetrators calling several times a night, showing up at their residence, showing up at their place of work, their school, their anywhere they may be. Um, Using drugs and alcohol as an excuse is something that we see a lot, as I'm sure you are aware of, is I'm sorry, I wouldn't have said that if I wasn't drinking. I'll stop drinking. I'll be better. I'm not going to do that anymore. And then making the victim feel as though if they were to follow through with that and stop drinking or stop utilizing drugs, that things would be different. And that's just a method that they use to get somebody to stay in a relationship. It can look like blaming for how somebody feels or how they act. I wouldn't feel this way. I wouldn't have had to do this if you didn't. I wouldn't have had to hit you if you didn't forget to cook me dinner. Just examples like that, pressuring to do sexually things that you either don't want to do or aren't ready to do, making you feel like there's no way out of a relationship, preventing you from doing things that you want to do or like to do. So it may look like having the power over all of the decisions in a relationship, who the person sees when they see them, how long they're able to see them for. No, you can't see your sister. You already saw her twice this week. Examples like that. Trying to stop you from leaving after a fight, or sometimes people will leave people places in order to quote unquote teach them a lesson. So this is said power and control wheel. Can take a look at it now, but I will send that out to you all to make sure you have it. So those are those different categories that I referenced, and we'll kind of take a quick run through each one of those. So I am having technical difficulties, and the bar is covering half of my information. So I just fixed that. So we should be good. But so starting with coercion, coercion is a big piece of domestic violence, and it's a very, very big piece of human trafficking, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But coercion is a form of psychological abuse where the perpetrator carries out a pattern of controlling or manipulative behaviors So they will hold power over their victims by intimidating them, humiliating them, or just trying to harm or frighten the victims. When an abuser takes away another person's freedom or their ability to have a sense of self and for self-worth, this causes them to be more dependent on that abuser, which creates that ongoing cycle. Common use of coercion would be making or carrying out threats to do something that would hurt the victim, threatening to leave the victim, threatening to commit suicide is a big one. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to hurt myself if you leave me. That can be a really hard thing for victims to deal with because there may be kids involved. They obviously care about that person regardless of the abuse that is happening. So if they have the abuse turned around and pinned on them and they feel it's going to be their fault if something happens to that individual or their perpetrator, they're going to be more likely to stay. Another common thing that we see is threats to report the victim to the state with false claims of they're abusing their child, they're neglecting their child, or just filing false reports for criminal charges or for restraining orders, coercing the victim to drop charges against them, which we know isn't necessarily in the victim's hands. However, people outside of the system don't understand that to that degree, so they will try and coerce the victim to drop charges, stop any criminal cases that are against them. And while victims can tell the state that they do want that to happen, that they do want those charges dropped, ultimately the ball is in their court. But that is another thing that is done: guilt tripping, emotional blackmail, coercing them to do things that they aren't comfortable doing. So more examples of this would be giving drugs or alcohol to the victim to lower their inhibitions so they are less aware of what they are doing, isolating them from friends and family, depriving of basic needs, depriving access to necessities. We see a lot of victims that are deprived from medical services or deprived from different things that they need for their own well-being because they aren't prioritized by their partner, and that is withheld from them to a degree in a lot of situations. The monitoring of actions, of activities, online communications, controlling finances. Financial abuse is a big thing that can rear its head in a lot of different ways. That may look like access. Now, a lot of things are electronic, as we know, with banking especially. That may just look like withholding bank account information so they can't access online banking. So the perpetrator has ready access to that information, but the victim has no idea what funds are in their accounts or how to access those accounts. And it can also be more of the dehumanizing, humiliating people, repeatedly putting them down, making them feel worthless as well. So this is something I did decide to keep in from my presentation with DCYF, and it is a part of the power and control wheel regardless, but these are some examples of how abusers do tend to use their children against their partners. And something that I feel like is overlooked is if somebody leaves their abuser, they're having to split the time with their kids. So they're essentially signing up more or less to have less time with their children. And there's an additional element to that of if they leave, they can't monitor their partner's actions and interactions with their children, and they don't know what's happening in that house at that point in time if they're no longer there. So using the children to relay messages to the other parent is a big
Mhm.
one.
Yeah,
Threatening
many,
to take. Go
yeah,
ahead.
many times, we see, um, using, the children, uh,
Mhm.
what were we talking about just a second ago there? I lost my train of thought. The one before this slide.
Oh, the
No,
which
no,
one?
no, no, the last thing you were talking about before
The last
this.
thing I was talking about.
Yeah,
Oh
the,
my, it's been
you
a
know,
long day, Brad. I don't know what I was talking about.
making the feel, oh, making the victim feel guilty about less time
Oh,
with the
okay.
children. Yes. So a lot of times, you know, if these guys are abusive towards the kids or neglectful towards the kids, one of the biggest fears is what's going to happen with the kids when they're alone with this person, and at least they're there to kind of monitor and be a buffer. And that's, that and finances are two of the big reasons we see people wanting to stay in relationships when they feel trapped.
For sure. So, and threatening to take the kids away, threatening to take the kids, move across the country, or different things like that. Very common as well. Prolonged custody battles are things that we also see a lot is when people are losing power and control over a situation, they're going to grasp at straws and do whatever they can to maintain some level of control over a person or a situation. So there are different methods that can be used to prolong custody situations, and it can involve just filing random things to draw things out, continuing court cases for much longer than necessary. All stuff we see fairly frequently. Visitation is just another opportunity for some people to continue abusing the other parent. And a lot of people use their children as sources of information on the other parent
Mm.
as well. Like, oh, did mom have so and so over at the house this weekend? What did they do? Did he stay the night? Questions like that. Just another way to keep tabs on their situation. So, and it's fairly common for batterers to interrogate the kids about that parent's activities from there of, well, did they do this? Did you do this? What did she make you for dinner? What it just maintaining those tabs, maintaining that control. And it's a very effective method, unfortunately, because a lot of parents do put their children's needs and well being above their own, and they prioritize their children and they care about their kids. So if somebody's messing with their kids and they can do something to reduce the effects of that harm on their children, they're going to do it. And that may look like staying in a situation to be that buffer, like Brad was saying. So on the power and control wheel, I believe the heading is using male privilege. I kind of changed the wording as to how gender stereotypes affect victims, because that it's still very prevalent even today. There is the notion that you're my wife, I can do whatever I want to you. I'm your husband, you have to do what I say. The mindset that you can't rape your wife is still very present in a lot of relationships on both sides, honestly. A lot of victims say that themselves of, well, I'm his wife, I signed up for this, I have to do what he wants when he wants to do it. A lot of people do still have that mindset. And this can justify, um, be a form of justification in why people treat their wives like servants. In some situations, it can be fairly common in domestic violence relationships for males to make all the major decisions and act as though they're more or less in charge of their wife, opposed to it being any sort of partnership. And that the man in the situation may define the roles um, that woman is quote unquote supposed to have in the relationship. Whether she's supposed to be cooking, she's supposed to be cleaning, she's supposed to be taking care of the kids. These are her jobs. It's still very, very prevalent, and it happens due to the historically established gender roles and these things that we've been seeing since the beginning of time. Is yes, we've made progress, and yes, we're moving forward, but a lot of these things do still exist.
Barefoot and pregnant.
Right. No, it's very true. And it's just due to the ancient mindset, more or less, of that women are of lower status than men are in society.
Well, and we've actually had, that's actually another strategy is overwhelm her with kids.
Mhm.
You know, we have a client that has 4 young kids under 5, and
Yeah.
he's of no help at all. And he's just overwhelmed her with kids. She can't work. She can't, she's taking care of the kids all the time.
Yeah,
So
no,
that is a strategy. And, a while back you were talking about alcohol and drugs. We had one guy that would, she was trying to beat addiction, and every time he wanted to get her under control, he left a bottle on the kitchen counter for her.
yeah, and I have an FEPS client that I don't know which client you're referring to with the children, but I have an FEPS client, which I would tend to argue that it's the same situation. She's 26 years old and is pregnant with her 6th child
Oh
Oh,
my
geez.
God.
right now.
Awful.
And it is like, she's not necessarily that she's not allowed to work, is she can't work because who can afford childcare for that many kids? And how is she supposed to find the time to do that? So I would definitely argue that that's the case in that situation as well.
Yeah.
So it does happen.
I think another piece to that too, for people who are religious, and the books, the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, all put women in a much lower position. And the words that are in there is the wife succumbs to her husband. And so therefore, if it's coming from there, even for
Right.
her, it's okay. That's what it says, but
Mhm.
not so.
No, and you're absolutely right. It's very common, and we've been identifying spiritual abuse in a lot more victims lately. I'm I doubt that it's happening more frequently than in the past. I think it's just much more heavily identified, and we are definitely seeing that fairly frequently at this point with a lot of our victims. Whether that's the primary form of abuse or not is a different story, but it is present in a lot of relationships.
And also, too, I think if it's throughout the family, then for the woman to go back to her family. But if they're also reading the same books and following
Yeah.
the same
Mhm.
church
Right.
and
Yeah.
going like, no, 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 this is what you're supposed to do. And this is how you live your life, as opposed to being able to get help and support
Yeah.
from.
And sadly, building on that, a lot of times when they decide to go to counseling, where do they go? Their church, the
Their
church
church.
elders, and they get reinforced again
Mhm.
that you need to submit, you need to listen, and you need to stay with your husband no matter what. I mean, he could be an absolute psychopath, and they would want her to stay no matter what.
Right.
So again, as we know, we serve all victims, but according to the power and control wheel, I'm just circling through that. And this is another piece of that, is that imbalance of power does reinforce that women do have a subordinate status, and it can be used to reinforce those historic gender roles and the norms that assume that women are inferior to men and that men do have a right to control women. So the expectation is that women will remain silent. They'll accept whatever behaviors that their husbands or their partners show. And there are a lot of aggressive male behaviors that are not looked down on in society, and I would argue are fairly normalized. And I wrote approved by society here, but I think it's something that isn't a lot of things are not questioned to the degree of it's just so normalized, different behaviors. So moving more into isolation, I think this is something that we're all fairly familiar with, that we see in pretty much all of our victims to a degree, I would argue. So typically, as a relationship were to progress, a balance is created where you start growing into each other's lives, you meet each other's friends, you meet each other's family, and you start to intertwine your two lives. And you do typically, in a healthy relationship, get the opportunity to continue pursuing your individual relationships and social time with your friends and your family as well. But when you're in an abusive relationship, that healthy balance does not emerge, and abusers tend to slowly sever all of your ties to your friends and family, whether that be emotionally or physically. And the victim is going to be less likely to leave if they feel that their only form of support is their abuser. And that's the goal in these situations. This tactic, it's very effective and it's fairly subtle, and it can be really hard to identify when it's happening. So this is one of the earliest signs of emotional and or potentially leading up to physical abuse. So relating that more into the emotional abuse is partners will start controlling what the person does, when they get to do it, who they're allowed to see, who they're allowed to talk to, how often they're allowed to do certain things. They may limit their access to information, control their possessions, um, control their possessions, monitor their cell phones, monitor all of their communication with the outside world, so to speak, limiting any involvement outside of the home. There can be a lot of guilt tripping and blaming as far as what do you need? Why is so and so more important than me at home with and being at home with your children? Why do you need to see them? They're not the one that's providing for you. Using jealousy to justify those actions. They may create excuse they're most likely going to be creating excuses as to why they shouldn't be seeing those other people in their life. Well, your mom's not good for you. She's always talking about how we shouldn't be together, and she doesn't see the um how great of a relationship we have. Constant check-ins with their partner. This is a really big one that we see, especially with social media and texting. We see people blowing up each other's phones constantly, and it's just a way to keep consistent tabs on somebody so you always know what they're doing. And a good portion of people in healthy and unhealthy relationships, I feel like at this point, share their location with their partners, which people in healthy relationships typically do for safety reasons, I would argue. But so it is very normalized in our society at this point in time to do that, especially in my generation. I think all of my friends personally share their location with their significant other for a million reasons other than being controlled. However, abusers are able to take that in that normalization of, oh, well, everybody else does it. Why wouldn't I be able to have your location? But they're constantly checking that. They're constantly saying, what are you doing? Why are you at this place? Why have you been there for so long? You're supposed to be here. Why are you here? And just abusing that power.
Sadly, all these red flags, when I've met with clients, they can identify all of them. You know, I'll start going over red flags and they start naming a few that I didn't see, and they'll go through them and it's like, well, you can identify them, but for some reason they're either so hopeful about a relationship or, you know, the guy's so subtle. You know, a lot of times she's his fourth or fifth victim and she's never experienced this before. So it's kind of like a guppy trying to defend itself from a shark.
Right. So the minimizing, the denying, and the blaming are all very common tactics as well. Again, talking about healthy relationships versus unhealthy relationships. In a healthy relationship, when you cause harm to another person, this typically isn't physical harm because we are talking healthy relationships. But when you say something that you know upset your partner in some way, shape, or form, you acknowledge it and you take responsibility for what you said or how what you did upset them or hurt them in some way. And then you will typically take the steps to avoid it happening again. And that happens in a healthy relationship. But in an abusive relationship, that person that harmed the other party in some way, shape, or form is typically always wanting to be right. They don't see any issues with their actions. They are going to try and get their way at all costs to maintain that power and control that they have over their partner. So this can lead into denying that they've done anything wrong in the first place, and or just minimizing their abusive or controlling behaviors, or they may just blame the victim in the situation of, again, I mentioned this earlier, if you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have had to do that.
And unfortunately, I think in today's culture, that can expand from beyond just a male-female relationship to things in society in general that we're seeing,
Absolutely.
and it's sad.
Yes.
I had a woman telling me one time that, you know, if I didn't make him mad, he wouldn't hit me.
Mhm.
And I said, oh, so when he gets mad, he hits you? And she goes, yeah. And I said, so does he get mad a lot? And she goes, yeah. And I said, well, has he ever been mad at his boss? And she goes, oh, yeah, all the time. I says, hey, how many times has he hit his boss? And she goes, well, never. I said, what do you mean never? You say when he gets mad, he can't help himself and he hits you. So why doesn't he hit his boss when he gets mad at him? She goes, well, that's because he'd get, I said, fired. And she says, yeah. I said, so he can control it when he knows there's consequences. And it was like a light bulb went on, like, oh my God, he convinced me it was my fault. And yeah.
Right, which leads into the using rationality and reasoning for acting in a certain way. So it was a very good segue. Thank you, Brad. So when their behavior's questioned, they'll divert the attention from themselves to the victim. And that may look like picking apart their personality or something that they did. And it may look like blaming the abuse on stress. I had a really bad day at work. I'm sorry. It's just because I had a really stressful day. You know I would never treat you like this, or you know I would never do something to hurt you. Drugs, alcohol, they'll blame anything and anyone outside of them realistically. And oh goodness, breaking things again. So blaming the victims for their behaviors so they appear responsible. It wasn't that bad. Get over it. Or it only happened one time. I won't do it again. Using intimidation, threats, anything to prevent the victim from leaving. And that leads into the threats of suicide, of that they would be responsible if something happened to them. And of course, they're going to care about that person. Regardless of the level of abuse they are suffering, they're going to have love for that person, regardless of any additional circumstances. Use of intimidation is a big one. So that's using body language, gestures, facial expressions, actions to harm the victim and giving dirty looks. I mean, when you add all of these things together, it adds up very quickly. And if they're constantly glaring at you, they're scowling at you, they're throwing temper tantrums, screaming, stomping, breaking things, we see this a lot of throwing things, slamming doors, punching holes in walls. It may not be harming the individual directly. However, it is an intimidation tactic, and the purpose of them doing these things is to control the victim and show that they have that level of power over them. And it sends the message. When somebody throws a plate past your head, sure, they weren't aiming for you. They weren't trying to hit you. But what does that tell you? It all sends a message, and that's the intention behind it.
I would point out that chimpanzees intimidate other chimpanzees by these same methods. So apparently we have not evolved as far as we think we have.
I really don't think we have. It's true. So abusing pets, animal abuse is a really big indicator of domestic violence. Destroying documentation, using that as leverage of, oh, you don't have an ID, you don't have a driver's license, you don't have this, you can't get a job, you can't be your own person, you can't leave me without these things. Brandishing a weapon is either like waving it around, just carrying it. Sometimes I know a lot of people carry weapons on their person. However, when you are an abusive individual and you combine that with a number of other tactics, that can also send a message to the victim in that situation when they know that that person always has a gun on them, for example. So that getting up in their partner's face, verbal threats, shaking their fists, threatening to destroy things that are important to them. So leads into economic abuse being another layer of this. It's just one of the many, many different kinds of abuse that we do see on a regular basis. A lot of victims are prevented from getting a job or maintaining a job, and a lot of people will lose their jobs when they're going through abuse for a variety of reasons, because and I say he, but it goes both ways, and we do know that. But most common case scenario at this point in time is he's controlling when you can use the car. He's holding the car keys. They're calling your work repeatedly to the point where your boss is fed up. He's showing up at your work and causing problems. And there's going to come a point where it's not good for the employer, and the employer is going to be put in the position where they are going to have to let you go. And that happens, and it forces partners to rely on their abusive partner even more. And it can make it nearly impossible for them to leave the relationship. Because at that point, if they don't have any money, if they don't have any funds to support themselves, what are they going to do? They either stay with a roof over their head where their basic needs are being met, regardless of if they're being abused. Chances are their basic needs are more or less being met in terms of having that roof over their head, having food and water. But if they were to leave, they don't have money to buy food. They don't have money to have a place to live. They're going to leave that situation to be homeless, potentially, if they don't have any family or friends around to support them. So controlling the vehicle, like I said, is one way. Some partners will make their partners give them some sort of allowance, even if it's their money, even if somebody does have a job, they'll require them to turn their paychecks over to them, not allow them to have access to the money that they earned. They'll control all the bank accounts, restrict access to any income. If they do need money, they have to ask for it, and they may have to justify whatever purchase they are going to make. Refusing to provide login information for bank accounts, we talked about briefly. Forcing to call out of work or leave work repeatedly for different things. And again, calling their place of employment or showing up unannounced consistently can definitely impact the work environment and cause the employer, regardless of how supportive they may be of the situation, it can put them in the place where they may have to let that employee go.
Economic control is a very, very, very common theme in a lot of these cases. I can't think of too many where there isn't some kind of economic control.
There's typically something there.
Yeah.
So justifying this financial abuse. It's a man's job to handle the finances. It's a man's responsibility to work or to provide for their family. Oh, I'm just taking care of the finances so you can stay home with the kids so you don't have to worry about it. Or framing it in the way that they are doing their partner a favor by taking on that responsibility. It's all in how you frame it. And I've said this 7 million times today in different circumstances, but it really is they are very strategic in the way that they frame things. And maybe they're just going to say, oh, it's just one less thing. I don't want you to have to worry about this. You're already doing so much. I don't want you to have to worry about the money. So just give it to me. I'll take care of it. And some people are not the most financially responsible. So there's the chance that they are going to use the excuse that I'll just hold on to all the money. I'll take care of it to help you become more financially responsible. That's why I'm making you ask for money that you've earned, is I'm teaching you how to be financially responsible.
These guys that are self-employed, like contractors, that is a group of people that is good at hiding money. I've seen contractors in court pleading poverty, particularly when the economy was slower, like, oh, jobs are drying up, but yet there's a $50,000 pickup truck sitting out in the parking lot.
Right. And doesn't bode well for my self-employed fiance. However, it is a very common theme that I do see in a lot of restraining orders. It's just an observation. But in a lot of restraining orders that I've done, I'll ask, because it says in the paperwork, like, what's their place of employment? I feel like there's a really good portion of them are self-employed, which I think is not necessarily that they have a really great skill set to the point where they started their own business. I think it's they don't have the ability to work with other people or listen to directions. So they're like, I'm going to be my own boss type of situation.
Also control. If they're their own boss and they
Right.
have their own thing, they're in control.
Exactly. They
So
have total control over what they do, when they do it, when they work, how much they work for. Exactly.
I had a client recently whose husband works for I think it was either some kind of oil or shipping company anyways. And I said, what does he do? And he makes lucrative money. And I said, what is he? She says, well, he's in management now, but he used to be a ship captain, like a huge ship. And I was like, well, there you go. He's perfect for it. So you're right. You're absolutely right. They like being in control and being the boss. So it's perfect for them.
Good point. So the significance of financial abuse, Brad was just saying that we see an element of this in pretty much every single case. And there is a study that shows that 99% of DV cases do involve some form of financial abuse. So this can often be the first sign of domestic violence. And not a lot of people have a thorough understanding that this is a really powerful method of keeping somebody trapped in an unhealthy relationship. If you don't have money, you can't do anything. If you don't have documentation if you don't have a license, if you don't have an ID, you can't open a bank account. If you don't have these different things, there are so many barriers to not having access to money, which you can probably think of a million off the top of your head, but there's so many beyond that as well. And so it is a very, very, it's an effective method, honestly. And a lot of people do have a fear that if they if they were to leave a situation, that they wouldn't have the ability to provide for their children or themselves. So if they were to leave that relationship, sure, they might be able to make it, but why would they, if they just put up with the abuse, then their children can maintain their life and not have their life uprooted, not have their lifestyle disrupted or changed in any way. So they just see it as a sacrifice of, I'll stay in this for my kids. I will stay in this so I, even for themselves, to maintain that level of security, because what you know, the devil you know is better the devil you don't, say, and you know what to expect. If you've been in an abusive relationship for 20 years, it may be awful, but you know what you're coming home to, more or less. If you leave that, the second you leave that, you have no idea what's going to happen. And oftentimes it gets a lot worse before it gets better for a lot of people. So emotional abuse is obviously non-physical behavior that belittles another person. So those can be insults, put downs, verbal threats, other tactics that make somebody feel threatened, inferior, ashamed, or degraded. Identifying this. So when one party is scared, confused, or feeling like nothing they do will ever be right, or it'll never be good enough for the other person, it may be an indicator of emotional abuse. It is a lot harder to identify because you can't see it. And you can see the effects sometimes of physical abuse, but a lot of victims and do argue that emotional abuse is more damaging than physical abuse. I've had several victims come to me and say, I've been in a physically abusive relationship in the past, and this is awful, but I would take that any day. I would, time and time again, I would much rather be in a situation like that than to be in an emotionally abusive relationship.
I've had women tell me that I wish he'd just hit me and get it over with.
Right.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's really eye-opening. It's awful, but it is so true. And the law doesn't recognize it to the extent that it does physical abuse for a number of reasons. And
Because you
just
can't
generally,
see it.
right,
Yeah.
You can't go
exactly,
to court and prove it necessarily.
right,
Exactly. So despite the fact that economic and emotional abuse are the two most common forms of abuse, that won't get you a protective order.
Right.
You know, there has to be a threat of physical harm for the protective order to happen.
right. So 5 signs of emotional abuse are if the partner is hypercritical, hyperjudgmental, if they ignore their partner's boundaries or invade their privacy, if they're possessive, if they're controlling, manipulative, or dismissive. Those are kind of 5 top signs that are seen in a lot of abusers. So some tactics that we also see are abusers threatening to harm themselves and say the victim did it. That's an interesting tactic I've seen a few times in terms of somebody being in an abusive situation and wanting to call for help or trying to call for help, and them kind of being confronted by the other party saying, go for it, call them. I'm gonna do this and tell them that you did it. This gets graphic and I apologize for that, but I had a client not too long ago that was in a situation. She was getting ready to call 911 and he took a knife and stabbed himself in the arm, more or less, and said, great, call him. I'm gonna tell him you did this to me. And those consequences for her doing that are going to be so far beyond her word of just saying that he threatened her or something that there isn't that physical level of physical evidence to. So there's the chance of, even if the police are called, if an arrest isn't made, there are situations where they'll be called, there's no arrest made. The perpetrator can kind of rely on that and say, well, if I did something wrong, I would have been arrested, and I wasn't arrested, so clearly I didn't do anything wrong. They don't believe you. I didn't do it, or else I wouldn't be here. Right? Blaming the victims for causing the behavior, like I've said in the past, and the victim will likely take at least partial responsibility for the assault in a lot of situations because of that manipulation that they have dealt with for so long. So as I'm sure you all know, there are a lot of emotions associated with victimization and fear, confusion, anger, potentially feeling numb or not feeling much at all. Very, very common in survivors. Feeling guilt or shame surrounding a situation, being afraid to ask for help because it's not only admitting to themselves that they're in a dangerous situation, but it's admitting it to somebody else, especially a stranger. Minimizing of abuse. It wasn't that bad. It was only one time, or he hasn't always been like this, or quite the opposite of, oh, he's always been that way. I'm used to it at this point. It goes on both sides, and a lot of people will make excuses for the person who is hurting them because, again, they are going to still care about that person regardless of the things that have happened. Not all injuries are visible. As we all know, just because you can't see the damage doesn't mean it's there. Even some physical injuries are either difficult or impossible to see without further testing, x-rays, or scans by a medical professional. And while assaults can result in bruising, cuts, broken bones, they can also result in internal injuries. So, I mean, you guys don't need this part, and this is again left over from my other presentation, but it's important not to assume that there's no physical injury if you can't see it. So I'm not going to get too far into this. I will switch gears in a minute here, but again, the dangers of strangulation are definitely a lot higher than realized by a lot of individuals, whether that be survivors, different professionals in the field. There are a number of signs to look for, and it is something that I have seen to be fairly common. Again, going back to, sorry to keep referencing restraining orders, but I am a court advocate, so that's where my brain goes. But it is something when in talking to a survivor, they're telling you their story, they're telling you everything that has happened to them, and this will just be thrown in there. Like, it was nothing, or that it wasn't serious, or that it might be so normal to them and it could happen so frequently that they just don't understand the severity of the situation. Of they'll go on and on for 45 minutes about all these things, and then they'll just throw in there and like, well, yeah, and then he obviously choked me a couple times. And they'll say it just like that. And I'll stop and I'll be like, okay, can you tell me more about that? And people just don't understand the severity behind it. And it is one of the most lethal forms of domestic violence. So again, we can't tell people what to do, but it is good to encourage people to seek immediate medical attention should they disclose recent strangulation to you, because unfortunately, delayed fatality is a risk in strangulation as well.
Are we not supposed to use the term strangulation when talking with a victim? At one point, I seem to remember I heard using the term putting his hands on my neck or something like that, rather than did he strangle you? I don't
I'll
remember.
defer to you, Brad, because I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I know at some point they were talking about getting away from the use of the word strangulation.
yeah,
Because you can put your hands on somebody's neck and not strangle them, but
yeah,
it's hard not to, actually, because it's not so much a restriction of airway. It's
yeah,
the carotid arteries going to
Yeah.
the brain that
Yeah.
get restricted. And when they let go, all that blood flow, all of a sudden, it's like crimping a pipe. And you ever take a hose and you crimp it and then you let it go and it spurts?
yep,
Well, that blood spurts up into your brain, which is all small little capillaries and stuff. And that's why you get the bloodshot eyes, because
Yeah.
that's called petechial hemorrhaging.
yeah,
So for instance, if you see a murder victim and they have those little red dots in their eyes, they were most likely strangled.
yeah.
So you're going to see that petechial hemorrhaging. And I'm not aware of particular ban on the word strangulation.
Okay.
I do know at one point
I
they
don't
were,
remember when or where, what the
Yeah.
context was, but I do remember hearing something about be careful of using that precise term.
yeah,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, which does make sense, but I think people do often refer to it as choking or different things of that nature. Of once you say strangulation, I feel like there's a pretty common misconception that choking isn't as bad as strangling, or
Mhm.
strangling's worse than choking,
yeah.
but they're the same thing.
Mhm.
I think
But-
choking is the word they got away from and went to strangulation.
Right.
Yeah,
So a lot of people will say, well, he's choked me before. And then you kind of dive deeper into that and like, well,
Yeah.
like, could you talk? Could you breathe? Like all these different things. And then to find out that it was strangulation.
Yeah.
But
It's not an airway issue. It's a blood circulation issue.
Mhm.
I can swallow the wrong way and start choking, but no one's strangling me.
Right.
So I'll let you read those, but 15 seconds of somebody choking you, strangling you can lead to a stroke, and it only takes less than 30 seconds to lead to cardiac arrest. So it is very, very serious, and something that I think people don't tend to understand the lethality risk associated. As we know,
Bless you.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, you're good. As we know, domestic violence impacts everyone differently, and um, it can depend on a lot of different factors. So that may be that individual's natural reaction to stress can have an impact. the coping mechanisms they use in a stressful situation, the age that they were when the trauma occurred, the extent of therapy or healing that they have participated in, any previous exposure to unrelated traumatic incidents, and the timing of any sort of intervention for that trauma can all impact the healing process. I'm not going to get too far into this, but we know there's so many reasons why people stay. And a lot of people are just very hopeful that their partner will change. And I will leave you with that people are very rarely all bad. There are good times and bad times, and people really like to hold on to those good times and hope for the best and hope that things will work out. So again, is people may ask the question of, oh, just move, just relocate. Okay. Relocating is not as simple as, while it may be one thing of like, okay, yeah, if we found them a new place to live, great, then they'll be good to go. They can start over. But these are just kind of some of the things that go into and can potentially go into relocating, and that's losing your income, leaving your job, potentially having to move your kids, put them in a different school, take them away from their friends, take yourself away from your friends, losing your benefits with your job, losing everything that you've worked hard for professionally, or personally. So there's lots and lots of reasons, and it does take an average of 7 times to leave an abusive relationship. And leaving is the most dangerous time in a relationship. So we always try and remember that. And I will send out that power and control wheel, but I think we've probably all at least seen it at one point or another. And if not, hopefully that was a little bit helpful in terms of knowing more examples of the ways that we see power and control present in the survivors that we work with.
Very good. Very, very good.
And references. Wow.
References. Listen, I'm still in school. I have to cite my
Yes, I
sources.
see that. I see that.
It's a habit. I didn't do those in APA format though. My apologies. So
Thank you,
okay.
Chris. That was very informative.
You're very welcome. Does anybody have any questions or anything on that front before we move into human trafficking? I know it's just such a lovely topic to get into. Glorious Tuesday.
But you know what? We've had some experience with it recently. So
Yes, we have.
We have.
yeah, I think it's a good time to have a discussion.
I think so too. So we'll get into that a little bit. Feel free to chime in at any time. I know it's a more foreign topic than domestic violence. Obviously, domestic violence is kind of at the head of everything that we do every day, and there are a lot of overlaps between how you provide support to a domestic violence survivor and a human trafficking survivor. As an agency, we do serve trafficking survivors as well. So it's good to kind of be aware of what trafficking means, because there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding what it does actually mean. So I will try and hopefully answer a couple of those questions for you tonight, but it's a good conversation to start nonetheless, and we can always get further into it at another time. If you have any suggestions or any questions or other information that you would like regarding human trafficking, I'm happy to try and acquire that. So starting from the basics, again, understanding what human trafficking is. The definition is the unlawful act of either transporting or coercing somebody in order to benefit from their work or service, typically in the form of forced labor or sexual exploitation. And I can send out these slides also. This one can be a little heavy on the definition and stuff like that, so it might be helpful to have the slides afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, an understanding there are different types of human trafficking, and in the role that we have, we're much more likely to be dealing with victims of sex trafficking because it is so closely intertwined with domestic violence, and it is, since we serve victims of sexual assault, it is a form of assault. So I'll focus kind of more on the sex trafficking, but labor trafficking is very common as well. It's just not something that we typically end up being involved in to the capacity that we would sex trafficking. So that is the recruitment, the harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of commercial sex. So that would have to be, that commercial sex act would have to be induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So I will emphasize the force, fraud, and coercion because when anybody talks about human trafficking, those are the three key elements, and those are the things that they look for. And another piece to that is child sex trafficking does not require any form of force, fraud, or coercion. It's the same definition minus the force, fraud, or coercion. That is an element in a good majority of child sex trafficking situations, but traffickers do not have to use any of those elements because a child cannot be involved in any form of exploitation or commercial sex by law. They cannot consent to that. So some examples of force in this situation would be physical harm, sexual assault, physically restraining a victim, confining them, isolating them. Fraud includes false promises that can be of employment, working conditions, wages. If you come with me, I'll give you a better life. I'll buy you anything that you want. I'll do whatever you want. Or the promise of a relationship, which can be really tempting for people that have not had a stable home life or had any healthy relationships in their lives. Coercion can involve psychological abuse, threats against another person, manipulation, physical or psychological isolation. There can be threats to report the victim to law enforcement, blackmail. Again, a lot of those coercion tactics, and we did talk about coercion in the domestic violence piece, is a lot of overlap there. So these are 3 myths about human trafficking, and something that I at least used to hear a lot before I knew much about human trafficking was that human trafficking and human smuggling were one and the same. And they're not. And human trafficking is not only sex trafficking, so that does include the labor trafficking as well. And human trafficking can affect anyone. So understanding that difference between trafficking and smuggling, human trafficking is a crime against a person. So that's again some element of force, fraud, or coercion that is used to recruit or manipulate somebody. So they do not have to be moved or transported anywhere to be trafficked. Somebody can remain in one location and be a trafficking victim. Human smuggling, on the other hand, is technically speaking a crime against a country and some sort of violation of a border where the individual is agreeing to be smuggled, and that ends with the person arriving at a destination. So that is a very common misconception that I had heard fairly frequently. So I wanted to throw that in there, that smuggling is very different than trafficking. In terms of statistics, in 2021, this is just hotline numbers. So this is identifying 10,359 trafficking situations were reported to the national hotline, and then that they had identified a total of 16,554 likely victims in the United States.
Do you have a copy of that trafficking hotline number?
I do.
Okay,
I think it's in here somewhere. I
okay,
think it's towards the end, but I
Okay.
can definitely, I'll make sure. And if it's not, I will certainly send that.
okay.
So again, another similarity between just general sexual assault and sex trafficking are that victims are generally recruited by somebody that they know. Similarly to how victims of sexual assault are typically assaulted by somebody that they know. So in 33% of cases, it was a family member or a caregiver. 28% was an intimate partner, and 22% was an employer. So it is estimated that 0.04% of survivors are identified.
Wow.
So I think that's very eye-opening, and it's very, very, very underreported, and there's a lack of knowledge surrounding how many victims do exist, for the lack of people that come forward. But also with trafficking, it's not a new concept, it's not a new crime whatsoever, but there's an increased awareness of it, but there's still a very high level of I don't know, it's very unknown. People don't understand what it is, and very, very few people identify that they have been a trafficking victim. So top recruitment location would be the internet. Sure, we're not surprised by that, but one of the top risk factors can be recent migration or relocation as well. Because when you have limited supports, when you're starting over in a new location, you are more likely to lean on somebody who may have ill intentions. So I covered a bit of this, but I will just reiterate that child sex trafficking is any involvement of a minor in commercial sex. A minor cannot consent to commercial sex. You cannot sell a child for money. It's not under any circumstances legal, nor can, regardless of their age, for example, a 16-year-old, say it was a 16-year-old performing sex acts on an individual in exchange of a cell phone. That's trafficking. So I think there's a lot of different crimes that people don't understand that qualifies as trafficking. So a commercial sex act is any sex act where anything of value is either given or received by any person. So that can be money, it can be goods, it can be shelter, it can be drugs. I'll give you a place to stay tonight, you just have to sleep with me. Trafficking, if they're a minor. It's also trafficking if it's an adult, if there is some form of force, fraud, and coercion.
So when they're talking down here of the elements involved, in order to prosecute, they don't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion with a child, but they do
Right.
with an adult. They have to show some form of, they have to prove that in court.
Right. Yes. So they would have to show that there was some form of force, fraud, or coercion if it was an adult in a trafficking situation. They don't have to show any of those elements. It just has to simply have happened. There doesn't have to be any circumstances surrounding that with force, fraud, or coercion for a child. They aren't needed for prosecution, but they are often involved. It does happen fairly frequently where one of those elements, at least one of those elements, are involved, even if it's not required by law. So these are just some general red flags of trafficking. Just because you see these signs in a person does not mean they are being trafficked. These are just different signs that are present in a good portion of trafficking victims. So if somebody is with another individual and that person is either controlling that person or speaking for them, not allowing them to speak for themselves, the potential victim is not dressed appropriately for the weather, potential victim has untreated medical conditions, or appears scared or submissive to that person that they are. So these are some more indicators if they're disconnected from their friends, their family, and their community. If it's a child, if the child has stopped attending school for a significant period of time, sudden or dramatic changes in behavior, if there are juveniles engaged in commercial sex acts, the person's disoriented, confused, or showing signs of physical or psychological abuse, if they show signs of being denied food, water, or basic medical care. Maybe they have disclosed living in unsuitable conditions, or they may act like they're being coached on what to say, and potentially are identifying that they are unable to freely leave their home. So traffickers leverage their victims' vulnerabilities to create dependency. Again, similar to domestic violence, risk factors of human trafficking would include mental health, economic hardship. So if somebody's struggling and needs money, they're going to be more likely to get caught up in a situation where they are, in terms of, again, speaking on sex trafficking, they're more likely to perform sexual acts for money, which may be legal in certain circumstances, but again, to make it trafficking with an adult, it has that level of force, fraud, or coercion. A lack of support is a big risk factor. Recent relocation, like I had mentioned, substance abuse, trauma, prior involvement in the child welfare system, having unstable housing, or being a runaway youth. So some common tactics that are used by traffickers are isolation, isolating their victims, moving them away from friends and family. They very well may alter the victim's physical appearances, cut their hair, dye their hair, wear different style clothes, continuously move around with the victims. They are very, very often conditioned to remain loyal to their trafficker. And again, this very well may be somebody that they know and had a prior relationship with in some capacity.
It also may be like the Stockholm syndrome where they start to identify with their captors.
Right. And a lot of people in these situations are conditioned to not trust law enforcement. And ultimately, law enforcement is going to be their best chance of getting out of these situations. Sometimes when they are extremely dangerous, that may be the best option, but they may not trust law enforcement for a variety of reasons. Physical abuse, torture, sexual assault, very common tactic, using drugs, keeping people under the influence of a variety of different substances so they physically cannot leave is unfortunately common. And traffickers are very strategic in using websites to advertise, schedule, and purchase sexual encounters with minors, which is very alarming, but the dark web has some very horrifying websites where things are presented in one way, and if you know the site and you know what you're doing, you know that you are actually signing up to purchase a child.
I was recently told of a website where you could access child pornography. And the sad thing is it was a thing that basically, if you were entering this if you were entering this word into a computer, I would have no idea I was going to that type of a site. You'd have to know what it is. It was like a very innocuous word, like, snowmen or something like that, or travelers, or there was nothing there that would indicate. But if you know where you're going, that's what you would enter.
They're very, very strategic, and some people have way too much time on their hands and do really horrible things and find really creative ways to do it and get away with it.
What would be the prevalence of somebody being arrested because they innocuously entered a word that would take them to that site where they had no idea what they were doing, no intention of going anywhere like that? How hard would it be to prove to the authorities that you're innocent?
Well, I would tell you, so little disclosure, I recently had, unfortunately, a relative who was arrested.
Okay.
Okay. He had all kinds of stuff on his phone. You don't mistakenly have 100 videos on your phone
Okay.
downloaded.
Yeah.
That if you had one or two, maybe you could get away with that argument. But I think if you have, these guys, if they're into that, they're going to have it all over their computer. They're going to have it all over the place.
Okay.
And it's kind of hard to say, well, I did it by accident. It's kind of like saying, I accidentally shot somebody, but you reloaded.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So while it may, I think that's a good point, is the people that do it maliciously, it's very evident, typically very evident what their intentions are. So when it's not your intention, if you were to Google snowstorms and some crazy website popped up, I don't know, I'm just making up a random word.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
I don't think I think it would be very hard for them to make an argument to arrest you, for example, for doing that
Exactly.
and ending up on that site, because I am going to go out on a limb and say that's the only thing of the sort that they would come across, and you had no idea, and they aren't going to find any other evidence of any other wrongdoing. So I
Okay.
think in these situations with traffickers and people that are doing these things are going to have a lot more search history and downloads and secret files and places and things of that nature that will make any criminal cases a lot stronger.
Okay. No, I get that.
But Recruitment opportunities. So these are some places that are fairly common places for traffickers to recruit people. School campuses, bus stops, train stops, shopping centers, parks, restaurants, shelters, texting apps, gaming services, computers. And some of those more common labor trafficking locations, I figured I'd just mention that, and this is kind of more common for labor trafficking. It's good to be aware of while we don't get too far into that wheelhouse. It does happen in domestic work like nannying, services, house cleaners, farms, factories, beauty salons, nail salons, restaurants, and construction sites. Unfortunately, there are beauty salons out there specifically. I have seen locally or anything like that. I've just heard of that have access to trafficking and have trafficking involved in their business. So why do they stay? Very, very similar to domestic violence. And a big piece of it is fear. And they don't know what's going to happen if they do leave. And isolation. They have been made to rely pretty much solely on their traffickers. They're not having much of any communication with the outside world at that point. So that's their only support system. Whether if it's a healthy support or not, it's often their only support. So it's either that or nothing. Guilt, shame, misplaced loyalty, again, goes hand in hand with the Stockholm syndrome, like Brad referenced, of feeling like that person really does care about them, or potentially even developing some sort of positive feelings towards the trafficker because they are more or less taking care of them, even if they are abusing them in other ways.
I'm going to age myself with this, and Krista, you might be the only one that doesn't get this reference. Patty Hearst.
Uh-huh. Yep. Do you know who he's talking about?
I don't.
Okay.
Look it up. Patricia Hearst.
Sounds familiar, but I don't. But they're expert manipulators, and that's kind of the bottom line. And I thought it was interesting to kind of mention some of the additional barriers that immigrant survivors face. So immigrants who have been trafficked, they have all of the regular barriers that anybody would, but they also have the limited language. They may have limited capacity to speak English or whatever language. They may have a fear of law enforcement or a lack of awareness of how the law works in this country. Lack of awareness of their rights as an individual, the awareness of services, not knowing what kind of services do exist surrounding them. They may be new to the area. They just may not know what forms of services exist in the country as a whole. There's the additional fear of deportation, the cultural considerations of maybe their culture is very different and very different things are acceptable in their culture opposed to what is here or vice versa. So I think those are some interesting things to be aware of as well. There are a lot of effects of trafficking, and it can prevent people from developing healthy social skills. It can affect how somebody makes or maintains friends, how they relate to others, how they ask for help. They may struggle to recognize their self-worth. They may have either educational or social delays, physical health problems or psychological disorders like PTSD or other attachment disorders.
A lot of correlations between this and domestic violence, because these are the same effects on kids that are exposed to domestic violence.
Right. So it really does go hand in hand. And wanted to get a little bit into safety planning for trafficking victims because, as you mentioned, we have seen this a couple times more recently. We do have a couple people who have come to us presenting as trafficking victims, and safety planning is essentially going to be pretty much the exact same as safety planning with a victim of domestic violence. But some of those key pieces would be encouraging to call 911 if they're in fear for their safety, planning an escape route or an exit strategy, having a bag packed, being ready to go if the trafficker does leave for any period of time so you can get away. Another important thing would be to have a written copy of important phone numbers, potentially memorizing those phone numbers if they are able to, in the event that they either don't have a phone, don't have access to a phone, the trafficker finds the phone and smashes the phone. There's a variety of different circumstances there where it may be beneficial to just either have a paper copy of important phone numbers, whether that be for starting point, whether it be for a family member. Avoiding dangerous rooms in the house. I know I talk about this in my safety planning presentation that you've probably all sat through at this point, but there are rooms in a house that are more dangerous than others. And those rooms can be kitchens, garages, bathrooms, and basements. Kitchens frequently have knives in them. Garages typically have very hard floors, same with basements. Bathrooms have toilets and bathtubs that can be misused.
Garages and basements have tools.
Yep.
That too. So some safer options to identify with the person may be like the front room of a house, maybe not in all houses. This isn't going to be applicable in all houses, but in some houses, the front room of the house you can see from the road, or a situation like that where you're more likely to be seen or heard. Being outside, obviously, if they live in an apartment building or complex, going out into the hallway. But generally just staying in rooms that have access to the least amount of weapons or items that can be used as weapons. It's going to be ideal, and you're going to want to stay in a room that has an exit or multiple exits at that. Another recommendation would be to develop some sort of signal with a trusted individual, whether that be a neighbor, a relative, a friend, or even it couldn't be, I say service provider, it couldn't necessarily be an advocate because we can't contact anybody for help. However, other service providers may be able to, if in terms of the neighbor situation, if they flickered the lights, they could come up with an agreement with their neighbors of, if you see me flicker the lights 3 times, call 911 or text me to make sure I'm okay, or call my mom. Just coming up with some sort of agreement there, or having a code word, a text that they can send out to somebody that says, if I ever text you and say, did you have a great day today? Or I don't know, I'm just making things up at this point. Like, call
Did you
for
have
help.
spaghetti for dinner tonight?
Yes, that's a perfect one. Right. That's less, yeah. So I like that one, but right, exactly. Something like that, that you come to some sort of agreement with that other person that they know that that's what's going to happen, and encouraging to have those conversations in person when possible. But it would be important for them to communicate the action steps that they do want taken at that point if they were to do that. Because if I flicker the lights, maybe I don't want any police involvement. Maybe I just want you to call my mom. So identifying that I don't want you to call 911. I want you to call my mom. I want you to call my sister. I want you to just come over and check on me, which it may not be a great plan. But just whatever that situation may be, just talking that through beforehand before you need to utilize something like that. And knowing that in terms of trafficking, leaving can increase the risk of violence just as it often does in domestic violence situations. So safety planning after leaving a trafficking situation, again, looks very similar to safety planning with a domestic violence survivor. Changing your locks, keeping your residence locked at all times. If you're moving, only disclosing your address to the people that you trust. Considering the address confidentiality program. Getting a restraining order, contacting that National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they can help you locate services that are closest to you. Documenting any unwanted contact, keeping that information, changing your phone number, blocking the phone number of a perpetrator. I know something that we see more and more frequently with technology these days is perpetrators will potentially have several phones or just use apps to change their phone number and send messages or make phone calls from a million different phone numbers so you can't block them. Because every time you block them, they're just going to call from a different number that's a fake number. So that's something I've been seeing happening fairly frequently as well. So telling your neighbors, your employer, your friends to call the police if they see the perpetrator near you, if that's applicable or any variation of that. And then just keeping a cell phone on you at all times if possible.
Also maybe being extra cautious of what you do on any social media, because even though you may have blocked the perpetrator or the trafficker, that person could get access to some of the people that you are friends with and find out through a back door where you are and what's going on.
Yes. And I feel like we see that happen a lot too. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, take down your Facebook page and don't post pictures of your surroundings because they're gonna, oh, I know where they are.
Yeah.
Right.
And
So
I think it's easier said than done for a lot of victims because I can't tell you how many times I've had a victim say, but I have to check on my
yeah.
second cousin once removed. He can't find
Mhm.
me there. But unfortunately, the perpetrator probably can
If
if
Right.
he's savvy enough.
if you're in that much danger, you should treat your new address like you're in the witness protection program. And one of the big rules of that is you do not contact anyone from your former life.
Right.
No social media. You are the gray man. You are, you blend into the background. You don't
Yep.
stand out. You don't do anything. You don't go into the same profession you were in before.
You basically disappear.
You disappear. And the U.S. Marshal Service has never lost anyone who has followed all the protocols.
They must go crazy with all the technology these days.
It's
Oh, I
hard.
don't doubt it.
It's
Yeah.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a very, very good point though, because it is so common and I see it on a smaller scale, just different inconvenient things when domestic violence or trafficking is not even involved of different people in conversations saying, oh, I don't know how so-and-so got that information. Well, if you have 600 friends on social media and 200 of them are mutual friends that they that person also has on social media, I bet you anything one of those 200 people is screenshotting whatever you're posting and sending it to them just because they want to stir the pot, or they want to feel special, they want to feel important, or whatever the situation is. It's very common, and it's so easy to do that. So it is true. And while a lot of victims aren't going to want to shut down their social media, there are different things that they can do to be smart about it and reduce the chances of that information getting into the wrong hands, because it happens, and it happens fast, and it is fairly easy.
And once it's out there, it's out there.
Exactly.
It's harder to get rid of it. Yeah.
Yes. So then communication, and look, very, very similar, if not the exact same, to supporting someone in a domestic violence situation. And I'm still taking the time to outline some of these because it's applicable in any of the work that we do. And I think it's important to know which things are appropriate to use in either circumstance. So we always try and remember that that person knows their situation best, and we take what they're telling us at face value. And we honor their requests. We maintain open and non-judgmental communication with that individual, remind them that they can call us anytime if they need anything. Sometimes in trafficking situations, it can be better to encourage speaking in person when possible. In some situations, there are multiple traffickers in a housing situation, and maybe that person is, or those people are in the home, so it's not really the safest option to be talking to that person via phone. So it may be best to try and speak to them in person. Likely not going to be possible in a lot of trafficking situations, but sometimes it is. So when you do talk to them via phone, you can ask if they're alone. You can use yes or no questions until they indicate that it is safe for you to continue talking to them. You can establish a safe word that they can use establish that word when they are alone, and you can have them use that word of, oh, like, how about those Red Sox, or like have something to say when somebody does enter the room, so you know that it is no longer safe to continue that communication and to cease that phone call at that point in time. um Learning what their needs are and what their wishes are. We can identify different needs for victims than what the victims feel that they need. There are different people that will want different things at different points of time. So talking to them and seeing what it is that they're looking for at that point in time can be really helpful and a good use of your time. So you're not putting time and energy into things that they aren't necessarily looking for.
Mm.
So again, these are both manifestations of power and control, both domestic violence and human trafficking. Survivors of both often suffer violence from those that are close to them in some capacity. And there's frequently physical or sexual violence involved in both. There's isolation, there's restricted movement, there's threats of harm, the name calling, the shaming, the controlling of finances or documents, or the threats to abuse the legal process. Those things all happen in both domestic violence and human trafficking situations.
Okay.
So that is the phone number that you were requesting, Fran.
Yep. Thank you.
For the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And it is a national hotline, but at the same time, they are supposed to have resources that can point you in the right direction to local services for
Okay,
anybody
good.
throughout the country. To my understanding, I have not utilized it. So I don't know, but that is the information that I was told. So you can call or text that, and they have a live chat as well.
Okay,
Um,
good.
so that's really good to know. And then they have those 200 plus languages that can be helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah,
So it's a good resource to be aware of. They can also help connect advocates or anybody to trainings, just provide general information, resources, as well as support to victims.
good.
Um, that is that. Pretty good time.
You are awesome, my friend. You really are.
Thank you.
You do
So are
the,
you all.
well, you do the deep dives that so many of us don't take the time or have the knowledge to do. And we appreciate you immensely.
Well, thank you
I
very
agree.
much. We
And just-
appreciate you all very much also.
Just to educate the younger people that are here, Patty Hearst was kidnapped in 1974, 50 years ago. So I think Fran, Brad, and myself are the only ones
Yeah.
that were around.
Oh, no, I'm way up there.
Okay. Krista, I know why you didn't, it was way before your time.
I hate to tell you, but that's the year after my dad was born. So, but no, that's for you're muted, Brad, but I know you're probably saying some colorful things to me in your head.
No, I'm just saying your dad probably doesn't remember it either if he was just,
Right.
if he
I
was,
did recognize the name. I knew I'd heard it somewhere. But
It was historical. You would have heard it. You would have
Yeah,
yeah.
picked it up. It was.
I just wasn't sure what situation it was. But thank you guys for joining us. Does anybody have any questions or things that they wanted to bring up or talk about before we carry about our Tuesdays?
nope,
No, I think something for me. I'm sorry, Fran. Were you gonna?
no, I'm good.
Okay. Something for me as I listen to all of this, and it's from the child's point of view and the child's eyes. And I understand. I'm not. I know it's hard to leave, and I know. But how do we further support, bring it out to society that these kids? It's not good for them to stay. It's not. There's no good reason for a woman to feel I don't want to put this a critical way, and I'm trying to but to stay for the sake of the children. No.
Right.
So how do we go forward supporting them? Yes, you're going to be in a new school system, but you know what? That's okay because you're going to have a different life and you're going to leave that behind because so many of the perpetrators come from families where that's the example that they saw.
Mm.
So
Right.
it's us, it's all of us, all of society moving forward to say, no, it's not okay for the kids. And yes, if they need something special in a new school system, if, coming into a new class somewhere, and it's a struggle. I wish I had an answer for it. There's a lot of things with kids I wish I had answers for, but
Mhm.
it's just strongly supporting them, women to say, no, go. Your kids will be better for it. You will be better for it. And we will support you in parenting these kids.
I can speak to that a bit now because we have a recent occurrence where kids have been involved. And I can't give enough credit to the staff at the shelter for the work
Mhm.
that they do with the kids. They support the moms, yes, but they also are very, very involved in making sure the kids are as comfortable physically and emotionally
Mhm.
as possible. And it's really, really rewarding to see the change in a child from the day that they come into shelter out of a traumatic situation. And 2 to 3 weeks later, they're different kids. And I give so much credit to the shelter staff because they work very, very hard, not only to help the moms, but to make sure that the kids are okay too. So,
That's
And,
great.
but,
and sadly, it's not always easy just to relocate and go somewhere because
Right.
the father still has rights. And unfortunately, the court bends over backwards to make sure that all parents, that the court feels, or the state feels, that it's in the best interest of the child to have both parents involved in the kid's life, even if one of them's a psycho.
yeah.
Right. Right.
So it's not always easy for, we have, unless you can prove somebody's dangerous,
Mhm.
and I mean physically dangerous, not psychologically dangerous.
Right.
Um, they're going to have some access to their kids.
Right.
We try to work to limit that a little bit. And fortunately, a lot of these guys, they start out like, I'm going to have my kids and I'm going to be a parent, blah, 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 blah. And then they find out, oh God, it's hard taking care of these kids day to day.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they gradually back off on their parenting time. Some people co-parent beautifully together, but others do not. And some people are better off apart, and they become actually somewhat friendly down the road, even though there was a formerly abusive relationship.
But it's a process too, because you
Yeah.
can see when there's an upcoming visit with the non-custodial parent, the kids can get very
Anxious.
anxious. They can
Yep.
feel intimidated. They can, if they
Yep.
were very well potty trained, they can start bedwetting at the thought that their
Mhm.
anxiety produces different reactions in each kiddo. And it's again, it's really a credit to the shelter staff that they acknowledge that A, this is happening, and B, they do everything in their power to help ameliorate the situation and cause the least amount of stress on the kids
Yeah.
and the moms, because the moms get very anxious when they have to think about relinquishing their control over their kids at that point in time. So
Hmm.
it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
And I think there is increased like that mindset that you're talking about, Trish, of the do it, like you're so much better off, your kids would be so much better off. And I think that mindset is more common than it was of
Mhm.
this is going to be hard. This isn't going to be the easy road, but it is going to be worth it. And that kind of empowerment in
Mhm.
that way, I feel like we do see a little bit more than what it used to be. So I do, especially from survivors' family members, I feel like that's kind of an increasingly more common mindset that I've seen with a lot of people that are saying like, yeah, this is going to be hard, but you're going to be better off for it. And the mindset, just I think publicly there is more of a mindset that it is more widely accepted that you should start over instead of staying in a situation for your kids, because your kids are going to be better off long term seeing you out of that situation. Sure, they may have divorced parents or they may have parents that may not be together down the line, but they're going to be happier and they're going to be healthier and safer in the long run, um, even though you guys are going to be separated. So I think there is um
Mhm.
that mindset is shifting a little bit, but again, it is so hard and it doesn't happen overnight, like you were saying,
Yeah.
Fran. But I do think that is kind of shifting of you don't have to stay for your kids because it isn't better. Having a two-parent household isn't automatically better for your kids, no matter what.
Mhm.
That's not the case. Is there are situations where your kids are going to be better off to have two separate households. Their dad might be great when he's by himself. He just may be abusive towards mom. So he may treat the kids well, but treat mom terribly. So he
Mhm.
might be able to maintain that relationship in a positive manner. Not always by any stretch of the imagination,
No,
but there are situations where that's possible too. So I think there are more situations where that mindset is kind of coming to light of you don't
Yeah.
have to stay, and it isn't necessarily going to be better for your kids to stay.
And you know, it's not only kids that are affected. There's been a couple of instances where I've seen animals come into shelter with their owners, with the shelter guests, and it's amazing to see the way an animal can be very tentative and frightened and very leery, and within a week or two of being away from the trauma, they're a whole different
Mhm.
animal. It's really rewarding to see that happen.
Mhm.
I've seen it a couple of times.
Well, and I think actually animals recover more quickly because they don't hold on to things like we do.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Um, on that same lines, we've been involved. Oh, I want to say maybe anywhere, maybe a half a dozen cases over the years that I've been there, where parental rights have been terminated on somebody because they were so dangerous. Um, but it's not always the case. I mean, I've been working with this one woman who, we're coming up on another hearing coming up, and while he was with his child, he took him in the night to stalk his. So he's now married to another woman, and she's now leaving him because he's abusive, and he took his son to stalk his wife. He actually took him in the middle of the night. They went to the property. He snuck on the property and put a tracker on her car, and then took him back a few weeks later to change the battery. And she still couldn't terminate his parental rights. She still had to fight. And part of the problem was his mommy and daddy have some money. So they hired him a lawyer.
Mhm.
She didn't have one. And she's not that good in court. She freezes up when she gets into court. She can tell me
Right.
before we get into court, but with the second we get into court, she freezes up and the lawyer intimidates her. And so, unfortunately, even though he's done these things with his child, she couldn't terminate his parental rights. And what we're going for is making her the sole decision maker so that she can, pull her child back if she needs to in an emergency situation when he goes off the rails like this, and he's involving his child in illegal activity while he's with him. And they say families don't do anything together anymore, but there it is.
It's heart-wrenching, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of
Yeah.
there's just so much, so much.
I will tell you what keeps you doing this, though, is when you get the call from the person that you've been working with a couple years later. You haven't heard from them,
Yeah.
and they're doing well, and the kids are doing well, and everything, their life has turned around. Sometimes they've met a new partner, and that's going well.
Absolutely.
So that's the reward of staying in this type of work. Because if you didn't get those calls, you'd be done pretty quickly,
Yeah.
or I'd be done pretty quickly.
Right.
No
You're
amount
not
of
allowed to retire, Brad. You're just not.
yeah. Well,
I know.
we're getting
I-
tired.
We're getting tired.
Krista, you've got to be the one to block the staircase to keep him
Yeah.
from leaving.
I know.
That's-
I've told him so many times he's not allowed to retire, but at the same time, it's hard because I also tell him that we care about you too much as a human being, and we know that you deserve this so much and you deserve to be able to retire.
that's
So
why
it's
they put
such a
me on the
double-edged sword.
that's why they put me on the third floor to keep me from escaping.
They're gonna
we
hear
can
you
catch
coming
him
down the
before he gets
stairs.
out the door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why we're giving Krista all the great training that she gets from so many different sources, because she's going to be the new Brad.
I am.
Oh,
Yeah.
she's
Well,
already there.
in the pecking order, maybe it goes Penny, Krista, I don't know, but whatever.
Well,
I'll
if
get
she
there.
if she
I
stays,
will-
she's clearly the future of, yeah, yeah.
And Trish,
So
I will
Yes,
look forward to meeting you in person at some point.
you as well, Fran, you as well. I have just one well, I have a couple of housekeeping questions, but just one. If when the schedule comes out, when the call schedule comes out,
mhm.
and it says call to fill, who do we call to fill? Like if I hit and call you,
Me.
okay, so it's not the backup people.
No, you
Like if I
call me
call you,
or
okay,
email me.
okay, all right.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I'll put you in the schedule. See, I can actually go into the answering service site and enter you
Okay.
electronically.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I was thinking sometimes, like if it was a day or two ahead, like, oh, well, I'm going to be home or I'm going to be, and
Yeah.
I can do this. So even
Yeah.
at that point, okay,
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
to know.
It's
All right.
funny when I couldn't see everybody when she was screen sharing, and I didn't know Bonnie had joined us.
I didn't know either.
And
I
when it
didn't
came
know either.
and when it popped up, I looked over like, why the hell is there a picture of a model here? And then all of a sudden I looked, I'm like, oh my God, that's Bonnie.
Hi. Yeah, I was driving, but
Yeah.
that was really informative. Thank you, Krista and Brad. That was great, like always.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
Any other questions or? No?
No, I mean, I think you guys covered it really well, of course. I was actually really glad that I was able to jump on because it was a good refresher of even some of that, strategy planning,
Yeah.
emergency planning. So just some good ideas to kind of go with that. So I appreciate
And
that.
Absolutely. And there is a human trafficking power and control wheel too. Fran, you've gotten so many power and control wheels from me today. I sent you one earlier and now I'm
Yep.
throwing two at you.
Yeah.
But there is one of those as well that I have that I was going to send out. So I'll send at the very least. Do you guys want the slides for both presentations or just the human trafficking one?
Yeah,
I'll just
both.
I'll send them both over.
Okay, that'd be great.
And then
Yeah.
I'll send the regular power and control wheel and then the human trafficking one. And then if you
Yeah.
guys have any questions or think of anything or want to chat, you know how to find me.
Okay.
Thank you very
You
much.
take
Sorry,
care
did
of
you say something to
yourself.
me, Krista?
No?
No, I think you're good.
Right.
I will just send all that over to you guys